Hello, welcome to Sociology of Crime, Week 6, Lecture 2. My name is William Wood. This lecture we're going to be following up from our discussion of Durkheim and social cohesion and anomie. So we'll be looking a little bit about his contributions to the development of sociological functionalism before we look at strain. So let's go ahead and get started. So leaving off from last lecture, it should be somewhat clear how Durkheim sets forth, or why he's responsible more than anybody else for, if we trace back the genealogy of functionalism, setting forth the ways that we can analyze the social functions or social facts of particular types of patterns within society, and then analyze those to look at how they contribute to things like the stability of society or adaptation, etc. So Durkheim then is the founder, generally considered the founder of what we call the paradigm of sociological functionalism. If you didn't see Lecture 1, please go back and take a look at that, particularly the second half. So this language should be a little bit more familiar to you here. This is from Traub and Little. They argue the major hypothesis in sociological functionalism is the recurrent social processes serve the function of maintaining the social system. Remember, Durkheim's very interested in what makes some societies able to persevere or have increased degrees of stability or social solidarity, while others seem not to. So with a larger whole as a unit of analysis, a social pattern is studied in terms of its functions or positive part it plays in the adaptation and persistence of a system. So to remind you, again from week 1, this is a macro-oriented paradigm, gaining prominence in the 1940s, and probably certainly the dominant sociological paradigm within much of American and North American sociology, maybe a little less influential, but still extremely influential in Australasia and Europe, focusing primarily on how societies maintain equilibrium, how different parts of society contribute to the operation or functioning of the system as a whole, how societies adapt or evolve, how social structures and institutions meet basic needs, and how to explain these differences and commonalities between societies. So this background of Durkheim is notable for us because of his contributions to criminological theory, as well as the development of concepts like anomie that have been used and torn apart and built back together again to be employed in many contemporary theories, as well as in theories that we'll look at that were dominant within functionalism in the mid-20th century. So both Robert Merton's theory, which is often just called anomie theory or strain theory, as well as Agnew's general strain theory, owe a great debt to Durkheim in his work. This concept of sociological strain runs through or is a part of influential in many criminological theories. As we'll see towards the end of the lecture, general strain theory in particular overlaps as well with things like social conflict theories, social learning theory, etc. So the term strain is a little bit misleading here. The first variant that we're going to look at, the variant by Robert Merton, refers to the relationship between social stratification and cultural goals or norms. It is most commonly used within sociology, and its unit of analysis is not the individual level, but rather levels of stratification. It's often called a middle range theory, and here's what we mean by that. If we have the individual here on one level, and society here, right? We're not seeking to predict individual level behavior, but nor are we seeking to make claims about society as a whole. Rather, we look at stratified levels in between, things like social class, for example. This is why it's often referred to as a middle range theory. The basic premise of this type of strain is that most individuals have a certain shared similarity in their cultural goals. We might think of goals as the things that they want. You know, Merton called it the American dream. He's an American. We might think of it as the Australian quarter acre. And then people also have varying degrees of their ability to obtain their goals through legitimate means. Right? When the means and the goals come together, there's little or no strain. the more the means are separate from their, the more their goals are separate from their ability to obtain these goals through legitimate means, the greater the strain, right? So the more these separate, the more we see an increase in strain. In terms of the second type of strain we'll look at, Agnew's general strain theory, this pays less attention to the role of social stratification per se, although it certainly allows for it, and looks more at how individuals at any level of stratification may experience strain. So then again, strain refers to this disconnect between social structures and individual goals or needs, which may pressure people to commit criminal or deviant activities. We'll look first at structural strain set forth by the sociologist Robert Merton, and then we'll look at individual strain as set forth in general strain theory by Agnew. Merton was a sociologist at Columbia University, but he wasn't a really stereotypical Ivy League professor. One of the best known 20th century sociologists, probably at one point he was the best known, certainly arguably the most influential. He was a student of Talcott Parsons at Harvard University, but he came from a poor family before he made his way to becoming a full professor at Columbia University. And he made significant contributions to sociology, some of which we won't look at today, his introduction of latent functions, for example, and some of which we will look at today in terms of his notion of anomy, which he borrowed from Durkheim, but then modified substantially to create this mid-level theory of criminal offending. So Merton agreed with Durkheim, whose notion of anomy that we just looked at in the last lecture, that the inability of society to provide for and limit people's needs and desires would result in anomy, right? He agrees with this. Okay? If people have desires or goals and society can't fulfill them in legitimate ways, this creates a sense of anomy or normlessness. However, Merton argued that moral norms need to completely regulate an individual desire, that moral norms need not to completely regulate an individual's desires. I will go back and change those notes. But rather their willingness to use unacceptable ways to achieve these desires. So, what Merton is saying in effect is impossible dreams or unlikely dreams themselves don't necessarily predict or progenerate criminal activity, right? For Merton, it's fine for people to dream and desire things up to the point where they're willing to use illegitimate means to obtain them. It's not the wanting that's the bad thing. This is where he differed somewhat from Durkheim. Durkheim argued that the wanting itself was precondition for anomy. But rather, and he called this the instability of human desires. Rather, Merton argues it's not the wanting that creates anomy, but the inability of society to regulate the relationship between goals and means to legitimate activities. Okay? So this becomes a problem in Merton's analysis when we live in stratified societies where we have goals that we tell most or all people they can obtain legitimately. Right? If we just work hard enough, if you just do the right things, you'll be able to obtain these things. But the function of a stratified society is such that not all people, by definition, can obtain such things. So this is why Merton's theory is often referred to as a strain theory, one in which everyone is presumed to succeed or to be able to succeed, but those who are unable or least likely to succeed by legitimate means are under the most strain to use illegitimate or illegal opportunities. Now, Williams notes, however, Merton himself rejected the term, preferring social structural theory, since he believed that desires and wants were largely processes defined by society, but the idea is generally the same. What you should take from this, what Merton argued, was that many of our desires, many of the things that we think of as intrinsically individualistic, unique about us, are patterned or conditioned by larger social structures. So the American dream, what everybody, and here it's important to note, Merton was talking about what people can realistically dream of or expect. He's not talking about the idea that we all realistically expect to win the lottery, but the idea rather that it's obtainable for most people to buy a nice house, live in a nice neighborhood, have a car to send their kids to good schools, etc. So the American dream, the Australian quarter acre, and so on. So Merton developed a typology around these levels of stratification, which he thought, or which he argued, went some way towards predicting the likelihood of engagement in serious criminal or delinquent activity in relation to the amount of strain that existed between individual group goals and opportunities to obtain them. Right? Remember, he did not develop this, nor is it used or intended to predict at an individual level, right? And although certainly general strain theory we can think of as capable of this, Merton's theory, again, a middle range theory. Why is it that some groups, he wanted to know, are more likely or statistically more readily available in criminal or serious delinquent activity? So cultural goals then, again, the things that most people want, the American dream, quarter acre, etc. The institutionalized means represent for Merton the ability of people to obtain these things legitimately. So he made the argument that those people in society, those groups in society that buy into the idea of these goals, right? Picket fence, house, again, nice house, suburban neighborhood, etc. People that buy into those goals and have the ability to obtain these goals. Many of you watching this video, right, had enough social capital to get into university. You'll take that social capital and successfully complete university. You'll translate that social capital into a professional career. These are the institutionalized means that Merton is referring to. So when we have little or no strain between goals and means, we have little or no distance between goals and legitimate means, we have little strain. These people, on the whole, Merton argued, are the most likely to conform to basic normative values and behaviors. The second category he called innovators. These are people that very much buy into the same dream, but for a variety of reasons are excluded or do not accept the institutionalized means from which to obtain them. So out of this, we might see a large number of people like entrepreneurs, people who are willing to take more risks because they don't have as much to lose, the means aren't available to them to begin with. But he also says, out of this group, we see things like organized crime, drug dealers, other groups that use or engage in illicit or illegal activity in order to obtain material wealth, happiness, success, right? So the classic example of this, for those of you who are fans, is The Sopranos, right? You know, the kind of updated version of the American mafia, where they engage in illegal, sometimes barbaric activity. But what does the mafia and the Sopranos do with their money? They move out to the suburbs, right? They want their kids to grow up to have normal lives. They don't want their neighbors to know that they're busy murdering people and chopping them up, right? So in a sense, they want to lead conventional lives and represent their conventional lives in terms of conventional forms of success. Okay, of course, the other mafia families know that they're not true, but the only outsider that really knows this is the therapist. And for those of you that haven't seen The Sopranos, I encourage you to, finish all of your assessments first, and then spend some time binge watching it at least, to get a sense of a good indication of what Merton would mean by an innovative group. And in fact, a lot of innovative crime comes out of communities or groups that are traditionally socially marginalized. So it's not surprising, for example, that mafia families, Russian, Irish, Italian, etc., that these are groups or organizations that, at least in the beginning of their movement into places like America or Australia, etc., were socially marginalized, couldn't get into the best schools, couldn't get into universities, right? Often relegated to menial or manual labor and so on. The third group, Merton calls ritualism. Here we have those people that might be able or that might have the social capital, but for whatever reason reject the actual goals themselves. So people that, you can think of here groups of people that drop out or, literally or figuratively, right? So, you can think of your lifelong bureaucrat who long ago quit trying to get promoted or, do much better, holds on to his job. You can think of the college lecturer who hasn't updated his lecture notes in 20 years. And people that in some way give up or do the bare minimum, but are able to continue to use these institutionalized means. So it creates a certain amount of strain, he argues. You're not likely to see these people engaged in really serious criminal activities, certainly not of the entrepreneurial type or, of the type that seeks to advance their cultural goals, since these are lacking. Fourth category, he says, is retreatism. Here we have a different type of potential serious criminal activity. These are people that are either really fundamentally locked out of being able to participate in mainstream society or have willingly dropped out, cults, for example, but also in some cases maybe people like, serious, homeless addicts or other things. He gives an example. So there are people that are maybe engaged in a lot of wanton street crime or day-to-day crime for survival, etc., less likely to be engaged in serious organized crime or crime that requires some level of planning or organization, purpose, etc. So you would see, maybe serious street gangs in abandoned neighborhoods, not fighting over drug territory as much as just, engaged in violence for violence sake. Finally, the last category, which Merton recognized a little bit later after developing the first four, is this category of rebellion, right? And here he recognized that in some cases, crime and deviance might actually be used or employed by people, and this is going back to Durkheim, because they are left out and they seek entrance into the legitimate cultural goals. The classic case study here, again, is the American Civil Rights Movement, where you had marchers, you had some, although Martin Luther King's philosophy was one of nonviolence, other types of civil disobedience, lots of race riots and other things, places like Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, significant race riots, Watts Rebellion. These indicate a willingness to engage in criminal or deviant behavior, to push to be let into the ability to obtain cultural goals through legitimate means, right? So this is maybe a less common type of example than innovation, but certainly one where we see many examples of people willing to innovate in this sense in order to be to push down the walls or those barriers to be able to do things like pursue the American dream or the Australian quarter acre. So Merton's strain theory was quite dominant up through the, let's say, the 1970s, early 1980s, increasingly criticized for a number of reasons that we'll look at following our discussion of general strain theory. So general strain theory follows the work of Robert Agnew, really becomes popular in the 1980s and significant by the 1990s. It's an attempt to apply Merton's strain theory to a more micro-level unit of analysis. So here we're really talking about group and individual level versus middle-range theory. Agnew was critical of Merton's theory. The evidence suggested that crime and delinquency was not concentrated in lower socioeconomic status, right? One of the primary criticisms that we'll look at when we return to this, the question then of why people with little or no strain engage in things like white-collar crime, corporate crime, etc. Strain theory doesn't do a very good job of describing cases like WorldCom or Enron or other multi-billion-dollar corporate swindles that were conducted and overseen by people who were already far wealthier than they could probably ever spend in their life, and certainly far wealthier than most people could even imagine. So instead of looking at crime in relation to socioeconomic stress, which was the primary driver for Merton's theory, general strain theory suggests that strain exists in different forms in all socioeconomic strata. So Agnew develops general strain theory in the late 80s. His overview from 1992 really summarizes it best. So this is an overhaul of Merton's strain theory. Agnew makes the argument that we can think of strain in three different ways, or as a result of three different things, again, occurring potentially across all socioeconomic strata. First, we can think of strain as a failure to achieve valued goals, positively valued goals. Second, we can think of strain as a removal of valued stimuli. Third, we can think of strain as the inability to escape noxious or negative stimuli. All of these, argued Agnew, produce negative emotional states or feelings. They put a charge into people, or they motivate people into particular types of reactions. So in the case of the failure to achieve valued goals, for example, things like money, right? Now, status and respect, argued Agnew, were equally important, right? And here we might think, well, this sounds a little bit like Merton, because money is a primary way in which people are able to, achieve cultural goals. But Agnew made the argument that money doesn't, there's certainly a certain level of money, on which you fall below the, baseline poverty or whatever. But above this, even for people that are wealthier, money is also a sign of status and respect in ways that can signify, for example, when one son ends up being a doctor, the other ends up only, being a manual laborer with a job that pays for enough, enough to, let's say, put him well above the poverty line. But the stress of the lack of respect or the lack of status, for example, maybe compared to his brother, compared to his parents' expectations, those of his peers that might have gone to a very good prep school, etc. That's a type of strain, argues Agnew, even though it's not putting him in a position where he's unlikely to be able to have the basics of the quarter acre. Compared to his goals, the particularity of his goals, from the setting, from the family, from his sibling relationships, his peer relationships, there's an indicator of strain. Status and respect are particularly important, argue Agnew, along with Lisa Brody. Lisa Brody's work made an important contribution to Agnew's particular theory. She brings in the gendered aspects, how strain plays out differently for men and women, or for girls and boys. The status and respect are particularly important for boys and young men in ways that manifest in higher rates of crime than young women. There's a link to that article there for those of you that want to take a look at it. Failure to achieve autonomy. So money buys us some autonomy, but not always, right? Some highly paid jobs, we have very little autonomy. We might, be under significant bullying or coercion. Other jobs that pay less might buy us huge amounts of autonomy. Think of being a freelance writer, right? Where you're able to write what you want or work. Sure you have deadlines, but they're somewhat self-imposed. So autonomy around your livelihood, but also around other aspects of your life as well, your private life, so on. Blockage of these may result in strain, argues Agnew. Also disjuncture between expectations and actual achievements, one of which I mentioned, for example, giving a lower middle class, maybe younger son coming from upper middle class or upper class family. Loss of positive stimuli is another generator of strain. Argues things such as the death of a loved one, loss of a job, or victimization can increase strain, thus likely to increase the gap between goals and legitimate means. Finally, the presentation of negative or noxious stimuli, Agnew argues, leads to things like pain avoidance from life events like neglect and abuse, or also negative relationships with peers. Research from Hoffman and Miller, for example, found that things such as parental unemployment increases likelihood of delinquency. So for Agnew, the equation is that the increase in strain in turn creates or manifests negative affective states. Anger, fear, frustration, depression, in turn leading to all sorts of delinquency, not just economic crimes, including illegitimate channels for success, burglary, robbery, drug dealing, etc. Attack or escape adversity, things like assaults, truancy. Managing the effects of negative or noxious stimuli through drugs and alcohol. So the question is then, how do people react to these states? So for Merton, the typology was these modes of adaptation, right? But what Agnew was really asking, and what he's really pushing Merton on is, but why do some people rebel versus innovate versus ritualize, etc., right? And for Merton, this depended somewhat or largely on their socioeconomic status. For Agnew, his answer is different. He says, no, it depends on their coping ability, right? Their coping ability might tangentially be related to things like social class, but not directly, and certainly not in any linear sense. So coping strategies include things like cognitive options, right? The ability to, in a healthy way, shrug something off. That's not that important. If you're disrespected, somebody bumps you, it's just really does it make you angry, or it was, in the grand scheme of things, not a big deal, right? Or it could be, cognitive options in terms of that you internalize things significantly. Oh, I deserve that, right? This kind of turning on oneself, leading to propensity for things like numbing pain through drug and alcohol use, etc. Behavioral options, constructively reducing strain or seeking positive solutions, or the opposite of that, of course. Factors that facilitate coping, things like intelligence, problem-solving skills, creativity. So here, there's certainly a social capital or social class element was recognized. Agnew wasn't saying that, all people have all of these across socioeconomic status the same. And socioeconomic status isn't the best predictor of these, nor can we reduce it, to the type of predictor that Merton suggested it was. And we'll look at a little bit why that is when we follow our discussion here. Or factors, finally, Agnew argued, that inhibit coping: delinquent peers or criminal dispositions, weak social bonds, etc. So some of the shortcomings. Merton's theory was very influential, and it still, in many ways, is a driver in part of larger theories. So if we look, for example, at some of the developmental life course theories, if we know what we're looking for, we can find Merton squarely in these theories. So Merton's legacy is, in some ways, somewhat secure. The problem wasn't that his theory wasn't useful, it's that it wasn't useful for many types of crimes, right? So the types of crimes, in some ways, if we were to think about, young men from lower middle class, working class backgrounds, there's probably more predictive ability. But as we'll see, this predictive ability runs out in many ways. While strain theory can explain why certain groups of people may be more likely to commit crimes, it cannot predict or explain why two people of the same strata differ substantially. Here we see the problem that a trait theorist would rightly pick up on: its lack of predictive power at the individual level. Nor does it explain why people choose to commit one type of crime over another. Fails to explain why most people who commit crimes of all socioeconomic strata eventually age out. This is a big problem for strain theory, because generally speaking, in industrial society, the strain of adulthood continues to increase in your 20s, 30s, right? You mortgage, more debt, other things such as this. But we see that the pattern of criminality doesn't follow this, right? Generally peaks, as we've seen in the age crime curve, in the late teens and early 20s, and begins to go the other way by the mid-20s. Or following on this, it fails to explain the onset of early delinquency before the advent of strain. Why do 12 or 13 or 14-year-old boys in particular, involve themselves, not many, but some, in serious criminal offending when they would have really, for all things being equal, certainly lower amounts of strain than they would later in the life course. Finally, the question that we started with, why do people who are relatively well off, who have little strain, commit crimes? Again, this is a primary question that we'll look at in the next few weeks that was first picked up on and pushed forward significantly by Edwin Sutherland and his study of professional thieves, white-collar criminals, other groups who, according to more traditional theories of crime as a product of low socioeconomic status, have a harder time predicting why wealthy people, people with significant social or material capital, engage in criminal offending. Criticized for his normative assumption of cultural goals, right? Rightly criticized by feminist criminologists, for example, and the kind of masculinization of goals, goals that typify material success, status, and so on. Question then, do all people share the same aspirations of the American dream or the Australian quarter acre? General strain theory is done better for several reasons. It's more empirically demonstrable. There's been a lot of research that's upheld at least part, if not all, of the arguments of Agnew's strain theory. So it's fared better, although it's much newer than Merton's strain theory. But it's fared better in terms of some demonstrable empirical rigor. It does have some shortcomings of its own, however, right? It's very different than Merton. And one of the questions that's often asked, particularly by psychologists, social psychologists, other people who look at through more medical model, is, does general social theory really measure strain, or are we really talking about stress, right? We're talking about heightened stress here and people's response to stress. And, I think psychologists have rightly asked, what is really the significant difference between strain as described by Agnew and stress? It borrows and overlaps heavily with other theories, and particularly how people cope, right? So it's been pointed out that many of the things that Agnew sets forth as new or somewhat new can actually be found in earlier social control theories, the work of people like Travis Hirschi, Walter Reckless. Social learning theories, right? Focus on positive relationships that can either reduce or increase delinquency and so on. So these are the dominant criticisms of general strain theory. Finally, anomy theory, as set forth by Merton, has made somewhat of a comeback due to the significant increase in global wealth inequality, particularly in countries like the United States, but also increasingly Australia, New Zealand, which have seen a return to the type of inequality of wealth that really set forth a lot of the early criminological literature that looked at crime as a result of, significant slums, deteriorated housing, etc. Right? So we've seen an increase in wealth inequality that parallels 100 years ago, the time of the robber barons, massive industrialists, J.P. Morgan, for example, Rockefeller, so on, where the amount of wealth held by a very small number of people eclipses, right, the amount of wealth held by the 50% of the entire population. So in the United States, for example, for some time now, between 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 children live in poverty, right? Poverty is endemic. Childhood poverty is endemic in places like the United States. So Mesner and Rosenfield in particular, but others, suggested that maybe, they certainly recognized the criticisms made around Merton's, made of Merton's strain theory. Suggested, however, that the increase in inequality, there's some returning merit to Merton's strain theory. Recent trends in American and other Western industrialized countries leading to increased strain between goals and means. So they argue that non-economic institutions, organizations, and language increasingly have taken a back seat to economic principles. More and more of us are having to spend more and more waking hours Even in the hours that we're not working, we're worrying about work or we're seeking work. We tend to view life increasingly through an economic lens, they argue. So the media as well presents a picture of the American dream as desirable, normal, obtainable. People cannot cope or do not achieve financial success, then viewed as suspicion or looked down upon. There's no surprise, they argue, that at a win-at-all-cost culture, people seek financial success through any means available to them. So this has been applied to a lot of research on types of deviance, like the growing increase in the acceptability of cheating in school, right? Where cheating on tests or cheating in other ways is seen as, by at least according to some research, increasingly acceptable by students as a necessity within an extremely rough economic future. So we'll end here. I just do want to point out that even though the larger arguments of Merton's theory have either been eclipsed or taken into general strain theory or other things, certain aspects of his theory are really making a comeback in relation to the growth of global wealth inequality and the socioeconomic strain that is being placed on an increasing number of people. Okay, so that ends week 6. I encourage you, as always, to write me or your lecturer or tutor with any questions. I wish you a good week, and I look forward to speaking to you all next week.